And it's recording. Hello, everybody. So this is my video response to our terrorism and national security debate. And I will be dissecting Mueller's and Stewart article. So I chose this article because I found it very interesting. Because while I fundamentally agree with the conclusion that the two, not the conclusion, but the core of the argument that the two authors bring forth, I also fundamentally disagree in the way they present this argument and how they interpret their evidence. But let's get straight into the argument first. So, core point that Mueller bring forward is that the US has massively blown out of proportion its terrorist threat. They bring a lot of examples to support this argument. First and foremost, they kind of address how Al-Qaeda is mostly a non-threat as an organization. They point to the fact that it has roughly 100 members and that the 9/11 attacks are what they tend to describe as a Trojan war attack, which is basically something that works because it's so surprising and insane, but in virtue of the fact that it worked once, it can now never work again, pretty much, like a Trojan horse. Hopefully wouldn't work again. They also argue that, a very important point they bring forward is that terrorist attacks have a tendency to make these organizations themselves as very unpopular against the populations they attack, and that they produce major backlash from the governments that are the subject of these attacks. Therefore, they're kind of their worst enemy in this regard. They also talk about the fact that counterterrorism strategies really tend not to work. First and foremost, it is they bring out the fact that, sorry, this is just a bit of a flip here, but they also argue towards the fact that it is extremely unlikely that any of these terrorist organizations will ever get their hands on or manage to create a dirty bomb, pretty much, and that it is stupid to kind of classify all weapons as WMDs, etc., etc., etc. But a very important point to bring forward is that a lot of counterterrorism activities, a lot of counterterrorism expenditure is completely unjustified, and they make this argument because first, they kind of debunk the myth that the public is unaware that most attacks are prevented without them knowing. They're very critical towards this unfounded statement. They also kind of criticize a lot of the literature that talks about how counterterrorism is used to prevent radicalization. And they make this argument very interestingly because what they argue is that terrorism, most of the time, is not ideological in nature. It's not about radicalization. It's not about Islamism. It's not about, Islamofascism, however we want to call it. It is mostly in retaliation against U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. That's an argument. Then they bring out the statistics that Americans' chance of being killed by terrorism attack is like 1 in 3.5 million in a given year, which, fair enough, absolutely. And then they do what I like to call a big, arrogant, stupid. The big, arrogant, stupid is they try to build this model that is supposed to calculate, given the expenditure and the risk of a terrorist attack and the cost of the terrorist attack. They basically calculate how many terrorist attacks should be prevented a year to justify the cost. Now, they do this by pretending to be statisticians and pretending to have knowledge of even like econometrics or things like that, or modeling in general. It's an intersection of two events times like cost, which is laughable at best, but the conclusion that they probably reach is that 333 major attacks should be prevented each year to justify the cost. Again, while I fundamentally agree that the cost of counterterrorism measure is extraordinarily high and probably way too high to justify the actual prevention, it's just not how statistic modeling works. This is just very basic and not correct. So, what are my opinions on this article? First and foremost, it's very tricky because the authors write this in 2012, which is before the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, before the rise of ISIS and a lot of lone wolf attacks. So the terrorist threat and scenery and modus operandi all have massively changed since. But still, heck, I'm gonna have a field day with this. So first and foremost, big problem, Al-Qaeda, 100 loser individuals. They talk about how they got lucky in kind of bringing forth the 9/11 attacks, but at the same time, you can't ignore that that is the same organization that 3 years earlier blew up 2 U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, killing roughly 200 people, most of them U.S. officials. That's not something that the U.S. can simply ignore. That is a major threat to its international standing and reputation. It is also a problem that, while the U.S. did respond to these attacks with a barrage of cruise missiles, they were completely useless because when those 100 people go back into hiding, it is very difficult for a state to retaliate against them. Because yes, a state has a monopoly of violence, but that is very difficult to use when we're talking about asymmetrical warfare. So, there's also the problem that Mueller and Stewart make the claim that terrorist attacks were primarily motivated by anti-US foreign policy opposition. Again, what we've seen with the rise of the caliphate is that while that statement might be true sometimes, it is a gross generalization, a profoundly gross generalization. Radicalism and radicalization is indeed a problem. Lone wolf attack across Europe, across Asia, across Africa, in the United States, in North America, were ideologically motivated. They were very often against countries that had no role in, say, the destabilization of Syria, of Iraq, that had no troops in the Middle East whatsoever. So they were ideological in nature. And that presents a very important new issue, a new terrorist threat for the United States, because the authors kind of joke about the fact that America has that estimate that they had like 2,000 to 5,000 Al-Qaeda operatives in their homeland after 9/11, but there is still not insignificant portion of its population that could be radicalized, and that is, of course, a threat for most countries. But I think the key problem with Stewart's and Mueller's argument is that it fundamentally ignores how and why terrorist organizations do what they do. Their objective is not, of course, the military conquest of the state. I mean, ISIS, again, it's a very peculiar case, but say lone wolf terrorist attacks in the States, or even terrorist attacks, honestly, in Iraq and Afghanistan, they are designed primarily to show that a government cannot protect its citizens from these attacks. It shows that the government is inadequate. It creates an unpopular government, a weak government, at least the image of a weak government. There is also the added benefit that when this government does in fact retaliate, like Mueller and Stewart argue, in the fact that these attacks are kind of their worst enemies because people are unhappy and governments then shoot them up, shoot the terrorists up. The problem with that is that government retaliation often ends up producing a lot of potential terrorist recruits. So, Professor, in your lecture, you rightfully argued that this point is often overstated, that it's not government intervention that creates the terrorist organization. That is absolutely true. But government intervention more often than not creates breeding grounds for potential recruitment. So, for example, let's look at domestic policing or harassing or even public hysteria. These things have a tendency to they result in the social rejection of what are often already ostracized Muslim communities, or even in Muslim countries, there is often a sectarian problem. There is often a Shia-Sunni divide that can be highly exploited by these attacks because, again, it creates this us and them mentality. So it's really not that simple. And also let's even consider the fact that, say, post 9/11, for example, or even pre 9/11, the US kind of often gave carta bianca, carte blanche. I don't know how to say that in any language, but allowed a lot of its allied nations and itself to kind of torture, imprison, and conduct a lot of targeted killings. Torture, really, and imprisonment in, say, Guantanamo really does massively help in terrorist recruitment. Take, for example, al-Zawahiri, the successor of Osama bin Laden in Al-Qaeda, who was kind of tortured by Egyptian authorities before becoming the man that he is. Actually, no, he was already en route to becoming the man that he is, but that 100% helped him create an Egyptian brand of Al-Qaeda. And targeted killings, I spent an entire semester creating what I hoped would be a good statistical model of why targeted killing create a negative feedback loop that ends up producing more terrorists. I completely failed in doing that in one of my courses back in Canada. But when you bomb a wedding, these things tend to happen. Now, of course, not all targeted killings are conducted in such gross and kind of fashion. But still, considering the importance of familial ties, of extended familial ties in a lot of these countries where targeted killings happen, there has been very often documented a domino effect that if you kill the cousin of my cousin, then you create kind of this branching out process. Whew. So all of this is to say that, and this also leads me to my final point of what is my opinion to be the best strategy to deal with a terrorist threat. There is no such thing as a best strategy, and that kind of thinking is a big problem because terrorist threats diverge massively. The reason behind terrorist threats or terrorist organization existing or recruiting or how they recruit, their modus operandi, these things diverge massively, and how we operate in response to them, be it through sensibilization campaigns, be it through raising awareness about the ostracization of Muslim communities in Western country, be it through integration processes, being through targeted killings and military intervention. All of these things depend on context. There's no such thing as the strategy. That type of thinking is profoundly flawed and a big part of the problem. So that was my video response, which clocked in at way too long, but I will try to make my next one a lot shorter.